Thank you, Patrick. As Patrick said, in just a few short years, we will be celebrating 300 years of worship in this location. Today, as we celebrate the centennial of this building, the first thing that's important to do is to recognize those in the past, or some of those in the past, who have researched and recorded for us to know some of the history of the church itself, and especially this building as we celebrate the centennial today. I'd just like to mention a few of those that we certainly appreciate all of their work. Many others that I can't mention, don't have time to mention, but just some of the names that, again, that might be, that you may recognize. Ms. Pope Rowan, Mr. Robert Earhart, Mr. Tim Truxell, especially the authors of our 2001 Old Providence History book, Nancy Sarles, Catherine Brown, Suzanne Simmons, and especially the notes and the minutes from all the organizations of the church, the women of the church, the session records, records of various committees that were put together primarily by these three ladies who wrote our book and put them all together in a form that we could try to understand a little bit the history of Old Providence. So if I can get my audio-visual man ready, we'll be ready to go. The last few weeks we've mentioned, and the ministers have mentioned, the buildings, Old Providence buildings. Basically, there have been four buildings. 1743 is the date given to the South Mountain Meeting House, recorded in the history of Augusta County and many other places. It's interesting to note that in 1743 there were some notations in various places that the term Providence and Old Providence was used. So even back then, the name Providence and Old Providence was used, even though it was established, the old log church that was built was called the South Mountain Meeting House. And there are other meeting houses in Augusta County, Rockbridge County, and we won't go into detail where those are. You certainly can read those in the book. In 1793, the folks that were using the old log church decided they needed a much better place, so the old stone church was built. And we tend to call it the Stone Hall and give it a proper name, but actually it was Old Providence. It was just called the Stone Church. But people call it Old Providence because that was the name that was being used. Interestingly enough, the land that was used or purchased for building Stone Hall was owned by Patrick and Suzanne Hall. Patrick and Suzanne Hall were immigrants from Ireland, Scotch-Irish immigrants that migrated down the valley and owned a large portion of land in this area. And they allowed the group to purchase land for them. And it's also indicated that some of the stone came from their farm, and also they boarded some of the workers. Finally, the old stone church became too small for the growing congregation. So in 1859, a new church was built across the road called the Brick Church. And again, we sometimes refer to it as the Old Brick Church, but again, it was Old Providence. Simply was built out of brick. They called it the Old Brick Church. The Brick Church was located across the road in front of the present cemetery and actually faced the Stone Hall. It did not face this way, but faced the Stone Hall. There are photographs of the building. The outside, there's no photographs been found in the interior. There are plans in the Heritage Room that Robert Earhart found, plans when they built the Brick Church, which is very interesting to look at. Finally, in the turn of the century, the membership had grown so large that something had to be done. The old Brick Church had become in disrepair. They needed more room. There was a big movement for Sunday schools. At that time, the Old Providence had Sunday schools around in the community, different places. established Sunday schools for people. And one of the big things was to see if they could find more room, figure out some way. And there was discussion about repairing the old brick church, but finally, as we'll see here in a moment, the present building was built. The minister at the time, just a few words about Reverend Lemuel Eccles. He was pastor from 1911 to 1922. There's an interesting description of him in our history book. One of the members at that time described him as a large, smooth shaved, and I don't know why that's important, but they described him large, smooth shaved, a man of adaptability, wonderful insight into human nature, and was equally at home in the sick room as well as in the pulpit. Now, from that, I'm assuming he, of course, visited and did all those things. During his time here, there was large membership growth. The Sunday school became very large. Had a tremendous few years here. He was pastor from 1911 to 1922. When he arrived in 1911 by train, he was accompanied by 2 sons and his mother. His first wife had passed away, so when he came here, he was a widower and actually married while he was here. Not a person of the community, but a person that he had previously known, a lady he had previously known. And his only daughter was actually born in the manse here. We talked about the timeline before. Timeline for building this building. I know Headley and Tom and some of the others who are in construction can probably attest to this. You just don't decide to build a building and then 2 weeks later you move in. It takes a little while to do. And it took quite a while for this building to be built. In May 1916, the congregation voted to build a new church to replace the old brick church. Again, it was in disrepair, it was too small. The building committee that was selected by ballot, and you can see the names are Fullwater, Rowan, Carson, Hemp, and Rowan. Rowan's an interesting name, just a side note. Many of you remember Ms. Ashton Rowan Chrysler, who was a very talented artist, who visited the church here many times, and the paintings in the passageway were done and presented to the church by Ashton. She was a wonderful lady. In 1917, an architect was selected, a contractor was selected, and construction actually began in 1917. In 1918, the notations in the building, in the history of the committee, said that construction continued. They didn't give a lot of details about what they were doing each day, but they said construction continued. In 1919, the carpenter work was about done, and at that time, the old brick church was torn down. And one of the reasons it was torn down was simply to salvage the building materials and use the money for the new church. Money was always very important, of course, to build this church without borrowing money. So that was very important. When we started talking about when to celebrate the centennial of this building, we didn't know the dedication ceremony was actually not until 1921. But when we saw that the first service was November 2nd, 1919, we decided to have something today, just almost exactly 100 years after the first service in this building. The dedication ceremonies were held in 1921, probably several reasons. They had to finish the outside, sidewalks, and there's also a notation that it was at the time of some of the great flu epidemics, and they didn't want to gather a large group of people together at that time. From the committee notes, the building committee, one of the members was Mr. Fullwater, who had a business in Rafine where he sold horses, carriages, and then automobiles. He apparently had a pretty efficient secretary because he would write notes and have someone, I'm assuming a lady, to type it, and they left a very complete set of building committee notes. So a lot of the information comes from that. And some really interesting things. They decided the location of the new church would be in the old schoolhouse lot. And that's what this part was called. The church did not own it. They had to purchase this from the McClure family. And at one time had been the location of a one-room schoolhouse, which was eventually moved to Spotswood and eventually became the school that was there later. But this is called the old schoolhouse lot. They selected an architect. They had a number of firms that were considered. They decided on a man by the name of Otho Miller of Washington, D.C. And the question is, why did they decide on him? And then we found in the history book that he actually had an office in Stanton and maybe moved to Washington later, or else perhaps kept the office in Stanton, but was well known to the building committee as local architect. The contractor was selected. They had bids from 6 contractors, ranging from $77,243 to $25,644. Pat, down at that, you have that?
I don't have it.
Don't have that one, okay. There were many subcontractors used, but finally they decided that the contractor would be Mr. A.B. Lotz of Spotswood. And Amos Lotz was the local contractor, and his home, his office, and his showroom was in the large white house that sits at the corner of Elmo Chapel Road that many of you came by this morning. It's also interesting, just as a side note here, Amos Lotz was at that time, he was selected as contractor, but he was also on the session. So you have to wonder if there's something going on there. But anyway, he submitted the low bid. Some interesting discussions, I would imagine, in this session about what he could do and couldn't do and so forth. But Amos was on the session at that time. And I think it's very interesting to note that Doug and Clay Frable are on the session now. And Doug was Amos Lotz's great-grandson, and Clay, of course, was his great-great-grandson. They're on the session now. So I think it's very interesting. There was a lot of information about the McCormick family, the Cyrus McCormick family. And I'm sure most of you know about Cyrus McCormick, the inventor from over in the Racine area, whose father started trying to build a mechanical reaper, and with the help of a slave that worked in the blacksmith shop, and with Cyrus and Leander, his brother, helping, they finally developed a grain reaping machine that would actually work, save a lot of money for the folks who was still cutting grain by hand and doing up very hard work. The McCormicks, that particular branch of the McCormick family, moved to Chicago because, again, that's where the grain was, in this country, was being raised, the majority of it. And they were very smart business people, and they knew that's where they could sell the machines. So they moved to Chicago, but they remained very close. The family remained very close to the McCormick's family that still lived in this area. And the Halls were the original owners of the land that Stonehall was on, were Cyrus McCormick's grandparents. And, Cyrus's mother and father and a lot of relatives are buried in the old walled cemetery. But according to the records, Cyrus Jr., the son of Cyrus McCormick, had visited this area, and apparently they visited quite often, again, family in the area, and became quite interested in the building of the new church. Probably came over to worship where his father was baptized and where his folks had gone to church, but became very involved in the building of the church, not so much interfering, but offering some suggestions. And he and his family, his mother and his brothers, actually contributed a huge amount of money at the time for the building of this building. I didn't average it out to see what it would be in today's amount of money, but it was a tremendous amount. But he offered suggestions at different times. They would send him plans, and he had an architect in Chicago that apparently they would look at things and they would offer some suggestions. And again, it's interesting to note that the building committee didn't always agree with some of the suggestions, so it wasn't like, yeah, we've got to do it like McCormick said, but they did use some of the suggestions he had. And one of the main things, at one point they decided not to put a basement under this building. They had run out of money, money was short, and they contacted him, and he said, it needs to be a basement, there's usable room there, and he would provide enough money, I think half of the cost of building the basement, of putting the basement in as it was. So, but again, they did contribute a large amount of money to the building of this church. Some of the features that's up on the screen was kind of interesting, was noted at the time. Very modern building for the time. They had steam heat with radiators. They had a Delco lighting system for electricity. And of course, the rural electrification didn't come to this area until the 1930s. It was always interesting to me what did they use for light, but a few years before they started building, there was an invention, a man, and we'll go into detail of the invention, invented a system called the Delco lighting system with the use of batteries and generators that could produce electricity. And the committee looked at that. They also had a couple bids from people that were going to put lamps in the building, coal oil lamps. Some of you know what coal oil is. I can't say it very well. I think at one point there was a note that said one man suggested 85 coal oil lamps for this building, which I can't imagine that many lamps and how you fill them and all that kind of thing. But they decided to go with the electricity, the Delco lighting system, and I think maybe Jeff still installed some of those systems. But anyway, some of the old wiring, I'm sure, dates back to that time. And probably something really needs to be looked at. But, another big thing was ladies and indoor toilets. Of course, at that time, there's very few places that had indoor plumbing, and indoor toilets were planned and were built in this building. From an article at the time, it talked about the buildings and auditorium seating for 388, and 75 people could sit in the gallery or the balcony. Now, I wondered about that number. Somebody, I don't know how they figured it, 388 people in these pews would be right crowded unless maybe the people weren't quite as wide back then. I don't know. One of the big features of this building was the Sunday school rooms. There had not been in any of the churches here at Old Providence with Sunday school rooms, and so the Sunday school auditorium with the classrooms were a very unique design that they put in, and it has some very interesting design elements if you've ever noticed. The rooms, although some of them have been changed, some of the rooms, especially in the corners, were at angles. They were not squared up to the halls or to the walkways. And all the rooms have windows in front, which can be raised, although they're probably sealed now with paint. But the idea was that those windows, in case it needed extra room, those windows could be raised and people could sit in the rooms, and all of them, you can see the pulpit from all of the rooms up there that have glass in them, and downstairs they have a clear view of the pulpit. So that was very interesting. The auditorium itself over here had permanent seats in it. The chairs exactly like the ones up on the balcony at one time. I don't know exactly when later they were removed, and there were folding chairs over there for a long time, and then of course they're not there now. We can put them over when we need them. But there were chairs there. They were also angled, so if you were sitting in those chairs, you were facing the pulpit. Another interesting thing, if you've ever noticed, up at the top of the opening, looks like a post in the middle, but there were doors that could be lowered to separate the Sunday school auditorium and rooms from the sanctuary. And no one that I've ever talked to, and I know I've talked to Robert Earhart a good bit, and he said he had never talked to anyone who could remember the doors or the divide, whatever it was, down and separating. My guess is, and several people suggest it was like an old roll-top desk, that the pole would come down. There are handles up there that you would pull it down, and if you look closely, there are tracks in either side where that roll-top would come down to separate. And I'm sure that was for purpose of heating. They could have maybe business meetings or something over there. Wouldn't have to heat the whole church. I don't know all the reasons why, but of course the big thing was that for larger crowds, that would be open. People could sit there in the Sunday school rooms as they did. Another interesting thing was the portico, which they listed as for carriage unloading. You have to remember this was 1916, 17, 18. And there were not a lot of automobiles, and they talked about the carriages could pull up and people could unload in bad weather out to the side here. Another interesting note from the committee, Mr. Fullwider, who was on the committee, had a dealership in Racine where he did sell automobiles, and quite a few times the committee noted that Mr. Fullwider took them by motor coach somewhere to look at another church. They mentioned Tinkling Spring, a church in Waynesboro, that they visited to get ideas about building this building. But I'm sure that was quite a thrill for everybody getting in an automobile and riding over to Waynesboro or Fisherville and looking at the building. This is very quickly just the outline of the basement, and as you can see, it has been changed. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The large meeting room, the ladies and men's toilets were downstairs. The ladies' lounge is back here. Did not have a restroom in it. There were steps in the ladies' lounge that led down to the ladies' restroom in the basement. And where the restroom is now in the lounge is where the steps went down. And on the other end of the vestibule to my right, steps led down to the basement, and the men's room was at the bottom of that step. There was no kitchen facilities or anything like that at that time in the basement. The church itself, the building itself, remains very much like it was when it was originally built. There have been a couple of major renovations, not necessarily to the sanctuary, but to the building itself. In 1966, it was finally decided to renovate the basement, and at that time in 1966, a complete kitchen was built. There was a large meeting room, there were classrooms, some of which would have movable doors so they could be opened up for larger gatherings or dinners. Also in 1966, there were renovations to the Sunday school area. The area back here that has the heritage room was the nursery. That was enlarged. The restroom was added. There is a small restroom in the heritage room off to the side, and also the restroom was added in the ladies' lounge. That was in 1966. And of course, the other major renovation was in 2005 when changes were done to build the passageway into Providence Hall. So the history of this building is very interesting to me, and I'm sure certainly I could talk for a couple of hours about some of the interesting things. At that time, the B&O Railroad was running up the valley, and a lot of the materials for the church came in by railroad to Spotswood and then were brought up here. They used as many local products as they could, lumber and any other products that they could buy locally. They used. Very interesting, the notes. Whenever they met, and they met almost weekly, and at each meeting, they would have some recommendations about changes, and they would just say, okay, that sounds good, we'll do them. And won't go into all of them, but it's quite interesting apparently how that committee worked together. To close, I would like to read a quote that appeared in an article in the ARP magazine at the dedication of the church, which I think is very interesting. The quote is, "This church begins a new epoch in her church life, and may she, with this splendid plant, move forward to greater service. Much praise is due both pastor and people for their vision and for their labor of love." And that was a quote that was in the ARP magazine. One more interesting note, and there could be many, but at the dedication ceremony, they invited back Reverend Haddon, who had been pastor here for many years, from Spartanburg, South Carolina. And in just a few minutes, we'll hear another speaker from the Spartanburg area, and we're very pleased and blessed to have him.